Hello and welcome to the Island of Flaneur. Today we're in the magnificent, historic, wonderful town of Hvar in Croatia. Hvar has a long and distinguished history as a centre for trade and culture in the Adriatic, so let's explore it. Let's go. The earliest signs of civilization on Hvar date back to Neolithic times and the so-called Hvar culture of 3,500 to 2,500 BC. This town has had many occupiers over the centuries, so let's try and make an attempt at explaining who occupied it and when. Hvar was part of the Venetian Empire during the 13th to the 18th centuries. We're now in the main square and we've just passed the Catholic Cathedral of St. Stephen. Hvar has been an important naval base during its history, and it's had a strong fortress from 1278. We'll be exploring that later and we'll go further into its history. The whole look and feel of the market square here really reminds me of Dubrovnik. So I think we're in for a real treat coming to this magnificent place. The ancient Greeks founded a settlement on the north of the island in 384 BC. The Romans arrived in the 2nd century BC and expanded many settlements on the island. And when we make it to the fortress later, we'll be able to see some stunning Roman finds. Hopefully the thought of these stunning Roman finds will hook you in for the entirety of the vlog. The Slavs arrived in the 7th and 8th centuries. At this time, life on the coast was not safe due to raiding pirates, and many of its inhabitants moved inland. In the picture we can see the fortress at the top against the lovely blue sky, and below we can see one of its more salubrious and swanky hotels. Following this unsettled period that must have lasted 400 or 500 years, the islanders asked the Venetian Empire for protection. We've now made it to the harbour at Hvar, and you'll see many high-end yachts and boats, and it's altogether a wonderful scene. And if you want a beer in one of the cafes that overlook the harbour, it might cost you between £10 and £15, so that's a little too rich for me. Also, they have a famous music festival here each summer, and the locals tell me that Beyonce was moored up here for a couple of days back in the summer. But go back 30 years to the early 1990s and the scene here wasn't so pleasant. We were in the midst of the Independence War, as the Croatians called it. I'll talk more about that particularly horrific campaign later in the vlog. This place that is now seemingly so affluent and populous and trendy, for want of a better expression, was something very different. It really was a ghost town. So the very good people of Hvar have suffered some bad times in amongst the good times. Now, with these wonderful scenes and views, you can understand why many tourists and visitors want to come here, though the war was only 30 years ago. Now let's get back to the Romans. We love a bit of Roman history at the Island of Hvar. The Romans used the island as a strategic and logistical base, keeping their boats in the protected bays of the Skedro and the Pacalini Islands. We spoke earlier of it becoming a Venetian port in 1278 and was under their control for 400 or 500 years, and it became the main Venetian port in the eastern Adriatic, but was under constant threat of attack from the main Turkish fleets in the area. A devastating Turkish naval attack in 1571 under Algerian commander Reza Ali laid waste to Voboska, Stari Grad and Hvar. It's no surprise that this place was frequently attacked. Hvar prospered under Venetian rule and was known as a place for wine, lavender, olives, rosemary, fishing and boat building, and had gained much prosperity. and I dropped in a map of Hvar as it looked in Venetian times. More than 4 centuries of rule from Venice came to an end in 1797, when the Austrians briefly took over before themselves being usurped by the French and Napoleon. To add to this tale of woe, the Russians bombarded Hvar in 1807 in a period of instability and warfare throughout Europe, until the Austrians retook control in 1813, a rule that lasted into the 20th century. And the tensions of the early 20th century met their peak on June 28, 1914, with the assassination of Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand by South-Slav nationalist Gavrilo Princip. The Balkans had really become the powder keg of Europe. And with 2 world wars and the realignment of Europe, we can see from the events of 30 years ago that many of those tensions never really went away. The Italians were back in November 1919, an occupation which lasted until the 1921 Treaty of Rapallo, which consigned the island to membership of the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats and Slovenes, later the First Yugoslavia, and then the Social Federal Republic of Yugoslavia post-World War II under Marshal Tito. Now let's get back to the hostilities of the early 1990s. The former Yugoslav army, JNA, attacked Croatia in July 1991, and Hvar was blockaded the following month. The main effects of the blockade were shortages of foodstuffs, normally brought from the mainland, such as flour, and no access to hospitals and main medical services. Now to our right we can see the arsenal. This was first constructed in the 14th century as a maintenance shipyard for the galley of the commune. That would be the Venetian commune. And we can see some information about the city walls. As this place has been under attack and occupied so many times, it's no wonder that the city walls have been fortified many times. Now back to the war of the early 1990s. Hvar did experience enemy attack, though never invaded, though the tiny airstrip in nearby Starograd was bombed at least twice. We're now climbing up the fortress. Now the foundations of the fortress here lie on ancient fortification from the first half of the first millennium BC to later Byzantium forts in the 6th century. And of course, climbing up to this high vantage point, you're going to see great views not just of the harbour and the port, but the surrounding countryside. The fortress that we see today began in 1282 under the Venetian government. We spoke earlier that they took control of the town in 1278, and the construction took a long time, often funded by the sale of salt. Now I can definitely confirm that the waters around here are extremely salty. I put out a swimming vlog a day or so ago, and these are probably some of the saltiest waters I've ever swum in. So I'm not surprised that the extraction of salt was a local industry. The fortress was strengthened in 1551, which may have saved the lives of Hvar's population, who sheltered here in 1571 when the Turks sacked the town, as mentioned previously. Today we see places like Hvar and indeed Dubrovnik as these extremely desirable tourist destinations. Indeed, Croatia is a wonderful, beautiful and scenic country to visit. Now, part of this was formed from an association in 1868, the Hygienic Association of Hvar, that for the assistance of visitors to the island had developed an infrastructure of hotels, apartments, restaurants, marinas, museums, galleries and cafes. And when you see these wonderful, stunning views that we have before us now, it really doesn't need too much help. Croatia and Hvar, with its rich maritime and rich colourful history, shall we say, has been home to recent archaeological excavations, and before us we can see some of those finds that were found on the coast just a small distance away from here, and before us we can see some exquisite Roman finds, some amphoras and other items of pottery. We'll take a sideways look now. We can look over the surrounding countryside with its pine forests, which seem to be really a feature of the landscape from the visits I've made to Croatia, past and present. And with the thickness of those walls and the presence of these cannons, taking the fort would have been some task. We're now just showing you some of the structures that lay within the fortress itself. You really can't get enough of this view from the top of the fortress. I've just dropped in an article just showing you some illustrations from the spectacular findings of an ancient necropolis on the island of Hvar. And now we're just about to go down into the prison within the fortress. Well, we're coming to the end of our vlog. I hope you've enjoyed this very, very brief journey through the town of Hvar on the island of Hvar, just off the Dalmatian coast in Croatia. The vlog has only just lasted 14.5 minutes, and within that time you can do scant justice to the rich history of this wonderful place. So it's goodbye from the Anglian Flaneurs. We hope to see you again soon. Next week I'll be back at work in the City of London doing my normal lunchtime walks. No idea, as per usual, what I'll be doing, but hopefully you'll join me.